When Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, an epistolary novel about a vampire from the Eastern European region of Transylvania who comes to London, he probably did not know he was about to release a classic. Nor, for that matter, did his readers once he published it in 1897. The book, in other words, was not an immediate success. Today, however, Dracula and the rudimentals of its plot and characters have secured a place in the Western popular imagination. Our society, over the course of over 100 years, has kept returning to this story. Why? Why Dracula? Why Transylvania? Why vampires? What is it that pulls the Western popular imagination back to these figures, these spaces, these tropes? Did they already have a place in our cultural imagination? The answers to these questions chart a journey from medieval Romania to our modern streets, where the path of the vampire turns out to lead nowhere else but our own subconscious. Did Dracula, Transylvania, the vampire already have a place in our popular imagination? Did Stoker tap into well-established cultural tropes, codifying them into a sort of pop culture canon? Quite simply, no. Its historical background is not the reason for Dracula's enduring appeal. There was no pre-existent knowledge of Transylvania, or the historical inspiration for Count Dracula's name, Vlad III of Wallachia, in Western society, because Dracula was not even a real person, but a figure of Stoker's own creation. Vlad III of the House of Dracula, also known as Vlad the Impaler, had garnered a reputation as a textbook cruel monarch in the European canon. But there was no connection between him and vampirism. While Vlad III was born in Transylvania, he was Prince of Wallachia, modern-day southern Romania, but a different state to Transylvania at the time. It is not known why Stoker chose the name Dracula, but it was not based on any pre-existing connotation of Vlad III with vampirism, or Transylvania in either the local or Western popular imagination. Neither was Transylvania connected to vampirism in the Western popular imagination. Vampirism was seen as a vaguely Central and European superstition, just as widespread in Hungary, Slovakia, Ukraine, and Bohemia as in Transylvania. Some have suggested that Stoker chose Transylvania because he read Emily Gerard's somewhat popular 1885 article on Transylvanian superstitions. While intention cannot be attributed to a historical actor without their personal testimony to the matter, what is clear is that Stoker was not building on pre-existing conceptions of Transylvania in Western society. Rather, it was Stoker himself who forged these connections, driven not by personal objectives against or for the House of Dracula or Transylvania, but in order to tell us the story he wanted to tell about his own society. So then, what is this story? Dracula is an epistolary novel, told as a collection of letters, diary entries, and other fictitious sources. It begins with a visit of an English solicitor, Jonathan Harker, to Count Dracula in his castle home in Transylvania. After Dracula purchases a house in England from him, Harker realizes the Count is in fact a vampire, but is unable to stop him. Dracula travels to England on a boat whose crew begin to disappear over the course of the trip. Once there, Dracula begins to stalk two women. He succeeds in killing one, but is stopped from turning the second into a vampire by the old teacher of one of her friends, Professor Van Helsing. Van Helsing then leads a vampire hunting party, which forces Dracula to flee England back to Transylvania. Van Helsing and the party follow him, track him down, and kill him. So far, so good. The story is fairly straightforward. But that, it turns out, may be its strength. This simple story has been interpreted to stand for so many things by its readers over time. It warrants taking a closer look. 4 principal interpretations stand out throughout its history. Firstly, that of xenophobia. The story contains a tale of immigration. Dracula emigrates from his home country of Transylvania to England. He buys a house there and seeks to become a member of British society. His role as a harbinger of death and doom can be seen to reflect social fears of foreigners who want to immigrate and integrate into society. More specifically, indeed so specifically that it warrants consideration as a separate interpretation, is the idea that Count Dracula is supposed to represent Jewish immigration. Dracula, then, is about anti-Semitism. The parallels are striking. The Count is not a poor but a wealthy immigrant who purchased an estate near London. At the time of Dracula's writing, some European Jews were profiting from the wealth brought by the Industrial Revolution and rose into the British upper classes or immigrated to Britain already socio-economically upper class. Moreover, Count Dracula is created to be a parasite, one which needs humans to survive by drinking their blood. The inhabitants of his home of Transylvania are just as affected by him as the inhabitants of England. This is unsettlingly reminiscent of the conspiratorial anti-Semitism which was widespread among parts of the late 19th century European society and saw Jews as parasitic of non-Jewish Europe. The time of the story's conception, the late 19th century, also has allowed for another interpretation, that of the fear of the decline of empire. At the time, the British Empire had reached its zenith, and talk in London had moved from where to expand to next, to how to hold on to all of its territories. Movements which sought to shrug off British rule were fermenting across the empire. Dracula, then, reflects fears of what would happen if Britain lost control over these territories. The imperial impulse had driven Britain across the world. The British public thought they were a civilizing and modernizing mission in these faraway places. Count Dracula comes from such a faraway place, and is a literal myth of superstition, thought to have been eradicated through civilizing missions, now not only turning out to be true, but also coming to the metropole, to Britain, to exact revenge. Lastly, interpretations have also noted a sexual element to the story. Dracula seeks to turn women into vampires who do his bidding. This entrancement can be read as a seduction, his means of executing it a sexual activity, penetration in the neck. A certain sexual anxiety on behalf of men can be noted, that Dracula will come to steal and corrupt their women. It befits a novel written in a time when male authors did not conceive of their female characters, nor indeed their female companions in real life, of having any meaningful agency. The existence of multiple interpretations allowed Dracula's stories to connect to audiences from different parts of society, creating and explaining its initial wide appeal. Yet one would think that in today's world, audiences could not connect to the sexual element of the story, given how society has changed in its perception of female agency. However, while Stoker may have been done with his story, the world was not. What one finds in the many decades after Dracula's publication is an extraordinary flexibility of this story, and of the vampire myth in general, enabled by its multiplicity and meaning. Stoker's novel itself was not a commercial success. Those to economically profit from it were the makers of the film adaptations of his stories decades later. In all of these, elements of the story were altered, which lead to even more interpretations. Vanna Murnau's 1922 silent film Nosferatu, which changed the names and locations of the story for legal reasons, for example, changes the structure of the story, in that it begins with a solicitor in his home country, in this case Germany. He is advised by his boss to travel to Transylvania to negotiate with a vampire, now called Count Orlok, which takes up most of the second act of the film. Orlok's journey back to Germany, where he commits most of his killing and is eventually killed, is placed in the third act of the film. The first thing which stands out in the 1922 adaptation is the much more obvious anti-Semitic messaging. The solicitor's boss is shown to be in league with Orlok, communicating with him in a hieroglyphic language, reflective of fear of an international Jewish conspiracy well and alive in Europe at that time. The Count himself is shown with enlarged features, especially a pointed nose reminiscent of anti-Semitic stereotypes, and is associated with rats in the film, also an anti-Semitic trope. His and his helpers' defeat comes not at the hands of an organized hunting expedition, but rather by the wife of the solicitor, who reads in a book that she can kill the vampire by exposing him to sunlight. She does this by seducing him to suck on her blood, sacrificing her life in the process. Orlok's helper, the solicitor's boss, is chased down and beaten by a mob, nothing less than the glorification of a lynching. The film bears another important similarity to real-life concerns: disease. Nosferatu was released immediately following the Spanish flu, and Orlok's arrival in Germany is presented as the arrival of a plague. People are forced to stay inside, the dead are carried off in large numbers, and of course the plague arrived in a ship by a character associated with rats. It appears as if the story of Dracula can be adjusted to reflect the concerns of different societies with different fears. This is reinforced when looking at another example, a 1931 US adaptation starring Bela Lugosi. This film's xenophobia is much more subtle and not necessarily anti-Semitic in character. Lugosi's Dracula appears as a well-composed gentleman rather than the monstrous Orlok. The film is a more faithful adaptation of Stoker's story, but notably Dracula is killed in his London estate rather than on the way back home to Transylvania. Like Nosferatu, this robs the film of an imperialist interpretation. What happens outside of England does not come across as important. Dracula is killed because of his crimes in Britain. It appears as if the fear of immigration is more pronounced in this adaptation than fears of far-off places in the world not under one's control, which would fit since the adaptation's country of origin, the United States, was at the time experiencing increased immigration and did not have an empire of its own, at least not in the British sense. While Stoker's version thus highlights 19th century Britain's fears of the decline of its empire, the same story could be reworked to reflect the concerns of 1930s US citizens about increased immigration. Nosferatu, which does not have a vampire hunting party, but relies on collective action and self-sacrifice for the community, seems to suggest collectivist ethno-nationalism as a defense against Jewish immigration. In later adaptations, the sexual theme also became ever more pronounced. Lugosi's 1930s characterization as a sleek gentleman from the old world was followed by Christopher Lee's similarly elegant characterization in the 1960s, and Francis Ford Coppola's 1992 version, which changed Dracula's relationship with his second victim to a love story. The vampire genre as a whole was at the time focusing much more on the romantic and sexual aspect of vampirism. Starting in the latter half of the 20th century, it was increasingly used to thematize what was then considered deviant sexual behavior. Films like Interview with a Vampire and The Lost Boys have been interpreted as allegories for homosexuality, capable of engaging with this concept much closer by providing their audience with a distance to what they would have otherwise considered non-normative behavior, by abstracting it via the figure of the vampire. When I say the vampire genre as a whole, I mean the genre that came into the existence in the decades after Stoker published his novel. For before Dracula, there was no vampire genre. Stoker, unknowingly, had founded an entire genre of literature, film, and television storytelling. Given its status as the founder of the genre, many subsequent works would make reference to the characters and locations of Dracula, or indeed explicitly associated themselves with Stoker's story. Dracula's Daughter centers on a female character who bites both men and women. The filmmakers were conscious of the lesbian implications of the latter, which at the time was still prohibited to be shown explicitly by US censors. As advertised in its title, the film's main character is Count Dracula's daughter. The film itself bears no resemblance to Stoker's story, but its production company marketed it as a sequel to Lugosi's 1931 film and reused characters from the original. Perhaps this was done simply for economic gain. Sequels are very profitable in Hollywood, but regardless of the intention, the fact remains, the connection to Dracula was sought out. Taken as a whole, the vampire in popular culture has become a stand-in for all kinds of social outsiders, interpreted as representing ethnic minorities, the LGBTQ community, and oppressed peoples from across the world. The 2014 film What We Do in the Shadows, a mockumentary about 5 vampires sharing a flat in modern-day New Zealand, is perhaps the best encapsulation of the flexibility of the vampire myth. One of the flatmates has a marked resemblance to the monstrous Count Orlok. Another is characterized as very sexually active. One even compares himself to Edward from the popular fantasy series Twilight in Conversations. Most of them have vaguely European accents, distinct from the New Zealand accents of everyone around them. The vampire, then, has become a literary figure to symbolize the other in our society. If the vampire in our culture has become an allegory to portray the other, the historical background which Stoker employed, and which has been faithfully reproduced in countless adaptations and other genre films, serves this purpose. It forms the necessary origin point of the outsider, which can be contrasted to the society Dracula travels to, Stoker's own social context, and that of all the others who adapted his story after him. In the novel and its early adaptations, Transylvania is depicted as a backwards place. Images of pastoralism and peasants in traditional attire fill the screen in Nosferatu and Lugosi's Dracula. The peasants are characterized as passive and superstitious, Count Dracula like an old-fashioned gentleman of times past. His castle is depicted as ancient and crumbling, his clothes as out of date, regardless of the period the film is set in. Nosferatu takes place in the early 19th century, Lugosi's version in the 1930s. In Nosferatu, Orlok wears aristocratic dress of the 18th century. Lugosi sports a frac, the common dinner attire of a European gentleman of the turn of the century. Coppola's 1992 version highlights the decor into the realm of kitsch beyond what a historian could consider accurate. But all of these share the objective not in commenting on Transylvania, its history, or Vlad III, but of using Transylvania and Dracula to comment on their own societies. In the story, and all of its adaptations, the audience is introduced to Transylvania through the eyes of the visiting Westerner, Harker. In suit or overcoat, he is the contrast to the old-fashioned attire of the locals. Their purpose, Transylvania's purpose, is to provide a contrast, an origin point for the other. Like in Dracula's Daughter, subsequent adaptations have made use of the tropes of historical background put in place by Stoker to tell their own stories, even if they do not share the same thematic goals. Hotel Transylvania, for example, tells the story of a Count Dracula hosting a gathering of monsters, zombies, mummies, etc., at his castle in Transylvania. But Hotel Transylvania is also a comedy and a children's film. Stoker's characters recur among the monsters, who are shown to be themselves afraid of humans barging in on their gathering, a subversion of the audience's expectations based on the tropes Stoker helped establish in the Western imagination. Either to profit off of their recognizability, or to comment on past adaptations which viewers would be aware of, Stoker's tropes are carried over to tell a different story. Dracula's enduring appeal, then, stems not from any public consciousness about its historical background, but from the permutability of the vampire myth to represent social fears and outcasts. Stoker's story itself can be adapted to represent many things, including xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and imperial and sexual anxieties, but it is Stoker's position as the godfather of the vampire genre that has cemented the continued recurrence of his figures and tropes in Western popular culture. In order to provide audiences with familiar settings, or to comment on past adaptations, new artists use Stoker's tropes to tell their own stories. The geographical and historical background matters not in this. Its ability to provide commentary on our own society does.